Anyway, so here's my introduction to the program. We're State of the Lake. You see sparkling lake water, an endless sea of blue. It's pristine, promising numerous fish and water creatures. A few boats in the distance, a sandy beach with children filling pails as moms watch. Lake Michigan, what a great place to build a city, next to the lake. And what a great source of drinking water for many nearby suburbs. How many of us get our water from Lake Michigan? If you live here in Hoffman Estates, or in Palatine, you have for the last 20 years. So aren't you glad you don't live in California and live instead near one of the Great Lakes? But how secure is our water supply here? Are there threats to that wondrous blue expanse, sometimes gray, sometimes green? Is anything being done to deal with threats to the Great Lakes, 20% of the world's fresh water? Who's planning ahead for us? And what do we need to know personally to help keep this precious resource available to us and our children and grandchildren? Do we have a role to play in this? Let's find out. But first, to run down the order of the rest of the program, we have three speakers, Tim Loftus, Judy Beck, and Christina Phillips, who will speak in that order. Then we will provide correct answers to the quiz, which you've been taking, right? And reference to the Protect the Lakes side of that, and perhaps some questions regarding those actions. And also some instructions maybe from Renee Gladstone, who has been working on the action portion of this program. And we have phone numbers and addresses to share. And then we will hear parts of a letter from Representative Tammy Duckworth from her office, as neither she or a representative could be here to speak. Finally, we will present a special thank you to our three speakers, so please wait for that. Tim Loftus is our first speaker. He is a great planner with much experience in the Great Lakes and Lake Michigan. Dr. Tim Loftus has worked for years on water planning, first for the Northeastern Planning Commission and currently for the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP. He's worked on watershed plans funded by the Clean Water Act and contributes to CMAP's facility planning area amendment review process. He directs a long-term plan called Water 2050 Northeastern Illinois Regional Water Supply Demand Plan. Tim works with communities, government units, and many regional organizations to implement this long-term plan called Water 2050. That's not now, that's ways from now. And he's here to speak to us tonight. Please welcome Dr. Tim Loftus, who has agreed to take questions at any time during his presentation.
Thank you, Susan. Hopefully you can hear me. If you can't, raise your hand and I'll raise it up a little bit. As Susan mentioned, with CMAP, which is your regional planning agency, we're legislated by the state of Illinois to do land use and transportation planning for the 7 counties of northeastern Illinois. And my role with the agency is really a very small niche, water resources. And so I'll spend the next 20 minutes talking to you a little bit about some of the work I've done on behalf of the region. And I know that most of you are probably Lake Michigan users, but I think to really understand the bounty of that resource, or at least access to that resource, it will be helpful to also talk a little bit about our neighbors in the region that are groundwater dependent, so that'll provide some good context. Susan mentioned I've been involved in watershed planning, which is funded by the Clean Water Act, and that is another role that CMAP inherited from the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission when we were formed, I guess, in 2006. All right, so hopefully you can see through my big head. I was hoping maybe we could maybe turn off the lights in the front if that's possible. Might be able to see the screen a little bit better, and it's a little distorted, but nonetheless, here are the 11 counties of northeastern Illinois. When IDNR asked us to develop a regional plan back in 2006, they wanted us to go beyond CMAP 7, and there are some light switches over there. Okay. That might be less dramatic, but I can't be certain. So we'll see. So what I've done here is I've color-coded the municipalities in this 11-county region according to their source of water. There you go. Thank you. So those that are colored in lightest blue, including where we are today in Hoffman Estates, drink from Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan. The dark blue are the groundwater dependent communities, and they source their water from either the deep bedrock aquifer or the shallow aquifer system. It's about 50-50 split. You can see there's a few communities colored green, so they're drawing on either the Fox River, as I do living in Elgin, or the Kankakee River. And then up there in Lake County, there are a number of communities that are some of the newer permittees. They currently use groundwater, but they received a new permit for an allocation of Lake Michigan water effective this year. So what you can't see on this map are the hundreds of thousands of people. There's about 400,000 people in this geography that rely on their own private well, and that's not depicted here. So this is just municipalities. So let's take a look at population here. Here are the 2010 census figures, and drawing in then to the CMAP 7-county region where there are 284 municipalities, you can see that over 80% of municipal population depends on Lake Michigan, with the balance being primarily groundwater with the green slice, and then the Fox River and groundwater as well with the purple slice there. In 2040, we're expecting quite a bit more people. We're going to go from about 8.3 million to 10.6 million people in the next 25 years, according to our population forecast estimate. You can see that Lake Michigan will continue to play a dominant role in being the source of water, but its actual relative slice of the pie is going to shrink a little bit, which basically tells us that a lot of the new people who are going to call our region home over the next 25 years are going to settle in a groundwater dependent county. And those 5 counties that are listed are either totally groundwater dependent, or in the case of the 2 with a little red asterisk, they're kind of split. Some communities use Lake Michigan and many use groundwater. So, you know, there you go. 55% of the new people we're expecting are going to settle in a groundwater dependent county, and that's potentially problematic. So I think it's fair for us to ask, you know, as planners and as citizens even, you know, how do we accommodate millions of more people and avoid a supply-demand imbalance? And I'm not here to suggest that we have a water shortage. We do have a water waste, I think, problem here in our region, but presently there's no shortage issue. But nonetheless, it would be foolish for us to always assume that there's always going to be plenty of water as millions more people come to join us here. How do we protect water quality? Many of our streams and lakes are impaired for any number of reasons, and so we need to remain vigilant in protecting and improving those water bodies. Here in Illinois, and certainly nationwide even, we have a huge infrastructure maintenance crisis that few people are aware of, because of course the pipes that bring water to our house and the other pipes that take sewage away from our house, they're out of sight, they're out of mind. Most folks don't think about it. We just expect the water to come on when we turn on the tap 24/7 on demand. But a lot of that infrastructure is crumbling. It has been traditionally under-serviced, under-maintained, and it's coming due on our watch in terms of having to invest a lot of money to stop leaky pipes, for example. And then, you know, maybe on a more theoretical level, you know, how do we shift perceptions and paradigms to become better stewards of a resource that most of us were raised to think was just always there, all but free, you know, and so it's going to take a shift in thinking. So we developed the plan beginning in 2007, and it was really the result of a gubernatorial executive order that was issued in January of 2006, calling on ID&R to, you know, direct two planning areas, one of which was here in northeastern Illinois, and the Illinois State Water Survey to support that effort. And as part of planning, you need to look at water demand. You know, you look at how many people are going to join us by mid-century and try to figure out, well, how much extra water will we need to accommodate, you know, new jobs, new businesses, new people. And that's what that report is. It was a pretty key piece informing the Water 2050 plan, which we published in March of 2010. So it's been 5 years. Time flies. And in this plan, we've got over 240 recommendations, and a plurality of them are aimed at public water suppliers, which in our region, as elsewhere, are dominantly municipal-run community water systems. Maybe about 15% of community water systems are managed by an investor-owned utility, but it's mostly government, local government that's in that business. And I should say that really the foundation of that plan was a new commitment to conservation and efficiency, because without question it is the smartest and really more importantly, most economical tack to take to reduce demand and therefore put off the need to search out and spend money on new sources and new infrastructure. This is a figure that's very powerful, because it basically says if you look at projected demand out into the future, if you can trim it down, if we can implement a conservation and efficiency program and reduce demand, that will oftentimes allow us to delay or even avoid indefinitely big capital improvements, which of course we pay for with our tax dollars. And so thinking long term, this is where conservation and efficiency really gives us the biggest bang for the buck. So for example, the city of Elgin, they had their consulting engineer develop a water master plan for them, and they determined that if they could trim water demand between 2010 and 2040 by 16%, they would save $16 million in deferred capital improvements. If you look at a community that's actually at capacity as we speak, the village of Huntley, you may know that there's a large Del Webb Sun City community out there. They irrigate their grass like there was no tomorrow. 22% of their water use goes towards irrigation. It's as much as 50% in the month of July. And they're maxed out, their ability to pump, treat, and store water. That's it. And so their population is about 24,000. They're going to grow to 58,000. And they've discovered that if they can trim demand 14%, they can save over $30 million in capital improvements between now and 2040. So conservation and efficiency is more than a virtue. It makes good economic sense. We looked at climate change. We took a worst case scenario. If it warms up by 6 degrees and we drop 3.5 inches of precip during the growing season, that will boost demand an extra 12%, which is equivalent to all the people and their demand for 1 year, 2005, that live in DuPage Lake and McHenry counties, 1.9 million people. So, the point is climate change will potentially add another stressor and boost demand considerably on our water supplies, and so that's of concern. I mentioned the Illinois State Water Survey. They did some very good scientific studies and modeling to inform our planning process, and so the plan is science-based, and they eventually came out with their report in 2012. So why don't we pause for a moment and just contemplate whether or not we're having a water crisis. How does Webster define crisis? Well, it's a turning point more than anything. And so let's think about what we learned coming out of Water 2050, a decisive moment here. That's what a crisis is. We learned that with groundwater, we're mining the deep bedrock aquifer. And you'll recall I mentioned that that's supplying half of the groundwater to the region's groundwater-dependent communities. Put simply, we're withdrawing it at a rate faster than it's being recharged, so there's nothing sustainable about that. We're overpumping the shallow aquifer system in certain locales, and where it was studied in the Fox River Basin, that overpumping has been shown to starting to capture stream flow. So normally, streams have water in them even during dry times because they're sustained by groundwater, shallow groundwater flow into the streams. But instead of that shallow groundwater going to the streams, there are certain places where overpumping for community water supplies is capturing that and bringing it down into the well. So that could potentially de-water our wetlands and headwater streams. Yes?
What percentage of the pumping is due to agricultural use versus domestic or versus residential?
That's a great question, and I'm pretty sure I have a slide almost at hand that will show how water use is divvied up amongst the 5 water sectors. Yes, sir?
How deep is a deep well as compared to a shallow aquifer well?
Well, you know, the levels of these aquifers is not constant, but as a rule, right here, for example, a deep well would be well over 400 feet deep, with shallow wells typically being in the 100 foot if it was sand and gravel, maybe down to 2, and then in the 200 to 400 foot if it was in the shallow aquifer system. So the deep bedrock aquifer actually gets closer to the Earth's surface as you go west. So if you get out in western DeKalb County, in Boone County, that's where the deep bedrock aquifer is actually recharged. It's not recharged here because there's a confining layer over it. One of the things we also learned coming out of the planning process, IDNR told us, well, we think we have about 50 to 75 million gallons per day of water available for new permittees. You know, now nobody knows what the heck that means. So I took a look at those numbers and I compared them to the water that has been allocated for all those communities on Lake Michigan water, and I discovered, well, that means that Lake Michigan is 96% allocated. I mean, to me, that sounds like it's almost fully allocated, and in fact, it is. The good news was we discovered that we could take more water out of the Fox River below the McHenry-Kane County line, which could potentially lessen growing demand on groundwater. And then the Kankakee River was not studied when we developed our plan, but it's undergoing study now. So there's our water sources. I'm going to kind of go through this one pretty quickly. I guess this is the point where I start to opine that, you know, we really could use to be doing some things differently. You know, if you have a permit for Lake Michigan, there are conditions of permit. We've been arguing for some time that some of them need to evolve, and in fact some did, and I'll talk about that momentarily. The need for public information and education is insatiable, really, and one of our primary audiences are elected officials, and of course they turn over many times, every 2 or 4 years. So we really do need to keep that up, and so I applaud the League of Women Voters for having this kind of forum to keep public information coming out. You know, the question right now is, can IDNR really enable regional planning and management of water use beyond Lake Michigan? Because they have a regulatory program for Lake Michigan users. It's the only place in the state where a community uses water by a permit system. Everybody else, it's sort of every man and woman for themselves. You can drill a well and pump to your heart's content under the rule of reasonable use, which works fine as long as there's plenty of water. But plenty of people think that that won't work so great once, you know, shortage or conflict might occur. So we might benefit from oversight beyond just Lake Michigan users. Water rates. We've been talking a lot lately about full cost of service water pricing. Traditionally, we really haven't paid for what it takes to bring the water to your house. The water itself is relatively inexpensive, but the infrastructure that is required to get that water to you in a potable fashion is very expensive, and with the maintenance crisis we've got, rates definitely need to reflect full cost of service pricing. So what I usually tell people is get used to using less water and paying more for it, and it's not so awful, because if you think about it, look at your water bill and what you pay, and then compare that to what you're paying for your cell phone, or what you pay each month for cable TV or satellite TV, and then ask yourself, well, what can I do without here, you know? And then lastly, I do think there's room for public-private partnerships, because all levels of government are if they're not indebted, City of Chicago, State of Illinois, they're strapped for cash, most municipal governments. So how can we take advantage of private equity and create public-private partnerships that help solve the problem while protecting the public at the same time? All right, let's move on. IDNR is trying to get back into the game. They do have an action plan. They realize, primarily as a result of the drought of 2012, that they are not well equipped to deal with conflict and scarcity. And in order to support regional plans where they have been developed, and then support the development of other plans where they haven't, they really need a dedicated source of funding. The funding that I've worked with over the years is very herky-jerky. It's here 1 year, gone for the next 2 or 3. It's no way to really do business. And so we were hoping in this General Assembly that a new initiative would be launched to raise a dedicated stream of revenue to support state and regional water supply planning, but with the new administration, that's on hold. And then once that's secured, they'll move forward and try to clarify their role and authority as well by tweaking a few pieces of legislation that really sort of spell out their role here. So you probably heard about the Great Lakes Compact. Illinois was actually the first state to ratify the compact, but we also don't really have to, we're not really governed by the compact. We do have to oblige with the conservation program provisions in section 4.2, but Illinois access and diversion of Lake Michigan is really ruled by a U.S. Supreme Court consent decree that says thou shalt not divert more than 3,200 cubic feet per second, which basically is 2.1 billion gallons per day. So that's what we can legally divert from the lake. This might be difficult to see, especially with the way the screen's a little bit distorted, but Illinois is working on a 40-year accounting period. And so that's what this first column is, 1981 to the last year of 2014. We pay attention to how much Lake Michigan water we take out of the lake. And so that's what this next column is. And in these blue rows, we were exceeding our allowance. And then this third column is sort of the running average. And then the fourth column tells us, well, are we banking a deficit or a surplus? And of course, we had racked up quite a deficit by the early 80s. We started to reduce usage, and even though these figures are provisional, right now we've banked about a year's worth of water in the lake. So we're using it within the legal bounds that we have access to it. Lake Michigan accounting is not straightforward. The bulk of it, which is domestic there, so 60% in this particular year, does go to communities for public water supply. And then the next biggest reason our access to the lake is debited is because of stormwater. We reverse the flow of the Chicago River, so any rain that comes down in the old historic Lake Michigan watershed gets routed to the Chicago River, the Chicago Area Waterway System, and instead of going back to the lake, it gets sent to the Gulf of Mexico, so that gets counted against our limit there. And as you can see, it can be over 25%, and then there's a few other ways there that the water gets used. If we look at that domestic water use slice, which was that 59%, you can see that there's a pretty consistent downward trend. So over the years, you know, we're using less and less water, I suppose for a number of reasons. Passive conservation use, or passive conservation because of the 1992 Energy Act might be one reason. You know, we have lost some big industry in the city and in the region over the years, and so at any rate, domestic use is coming down. So maybe that slide isn't in this presentation. The biggest user of water in the region is thermoelectric power generation, but that's almost all non-consumptive. You know, they borrow the water to cool their system for generating electricity, and then they pass it right back usually to the river from whence it came, albeit at a much warmer temperature and maybe with a little chemistry change. If you back out that sector, then the dominant use is public water supply. So for our communities, for our homes and businesses, that's 80%. The next biggest slice is self-supplied commercial and industrial, 11 or 12%. So now we're up to 90, we're over 90%. So agriculture, self-supplied, mining, and I guess those are the other sectors. They're all relatively small, single-digit uses. So 80% is public supply. So we, how am I doing on time here? I don't want to. Are we good? Okay.
5 more minutes.
Okay. I did a study with the Center for Neighborhood Technology, working with Lake Michigan users, trying to figure out, you know, what their challenges are with respect to water loss, because there's a bit of a water loss issue here that the region needs to deal with. So this is, what, 7 years worth of data, 2007 to 2013. One of the conditions of permit, if you use Lake Michigan water, is, and it just changed, but it used to be, you can't have more than 8% unaccounted for flow, which is water loss. So that gray bar on the left for each year shows how many permittees have exceeded that condition of permit. And that's about 22% of the permittees that are community water suppliers over this 7-year period have exceeded that condition of permit. There's an allowance that historically has been made, and I think it was largely to accommodate the city of Chicago because it's an old city with a lot of old pipes. This maximum unavoidable loss, that's what MUL means. And it basically allowed communities to write off a certain amount of water loss based on the age of their pipes. But that's gone away. So there have been amendments to rules that took effect in November. We're getting rid of this outdated notion of unaccounted for flow, and we're now going to talk about it in terms of non-revenue water, because that's what it really is. We're no longer going to allow this amount of loss based on old pipes. We're going to call a spade, if you will. And so if that allowance was accurate, then these other two blue bars are looking at how many permittees are going to be out of compliance with the new 12% interim non-revenue water standard. And it's considerable. It's about half of the permittees right now, based on these 7 years of data, or I should say, if at any time during these 7 years they had to deal with a 12% non-revenue water standard, over half of them would be out of compliance. In 4 years' time, that standard is going to lower to 10%, so it's going to become a little more stringent. And non-revenue water is a combination of lost water from leaky pipes, and then data handling errors, metering errors, errors in the accounting department, and so forth, theft even. So anyway, this just suggests, hopefully in something a little clearer than mud, that we have a real challenge on our hands with communities needing to address and reduce their non-revenue water. Yes?
Is there not a penalty for not meeting compliance, that it's like a financial penalty?
No. There isn't.
The state legislature to impose some kind of penalty?
Well, I mean, I think the philosophy of the ID in our office is not to pit state government against local government. And so rather than penalize a community for exceeding their limit, they'd rather see a water system improvement plan and a real commitment in place that they're trying to address it. So that's what's going on, for better or for worse. But we asked a few questions when we did this study. We did a survey via the internet, and we asked communities to describe their formal water loss control policy, and what we discovered is 3/4 of communities do not have a formal water loss policy. So we thought that was instructive. We were curious to know, well, how often does the water department communicate water loss with two audiences? A, their village board or city council, right, their elected officials, and then B, all of us that get a bill in the mail are the ratepayers. And what we discovered in the case of communicating water loss to customers is 73% don't. And living, I don't want to call out Elgin, but I live there, and I never hear anything about water loss from my utility, and you might ask yourself if you do. In terms of communicating water loss with elected officials, pretty similar, 70%, 75% are once a year, 7% are never, and so what is that, 82% either never or once a year discuss water loss with their elected officials. And so, a picture is beginning to emerge, we think, as to maybe why this is a hidden problem.
Question. The water that leaks out of the pipes and so on, doesn't that just end up back in the groundwater and help replenish the aquifer?
It can, but it's a pretty expensive way to do that. And of course, if you're short on groundwater or you have a limit to Lake Michigan water, it's just not probably the best thing to be doing. Nobody's saying that water loss needs to get down to 0%. There is an economic level of loss that every community needs to figure out. At what point will I spend $1 to fix a leak when it's only going to yield $1 or 99 cents of savings. You know, you don't want to continue spending money on water loss beyond that point. But most communities, I don't think, understand what their economic level of loss is. Anyway, let's talk just a moment about water rates. One of the conditions of permit is, you know, you're supposed to have a rate structure in place that discourages excessive use. But what we found was 3/4 of respondents have just a uniform volumetric rate, so it doesn't matter how much you use, it's going to be the same per thousand price. And only 9% use an inverted block rate, which is really conservation pricing. So, you know, you get to use a certain amount for your basic needs, but once you cross over a threshold because you like to water your grass every day or wash your cars every day, you know, an inverted block rate would charge more for that incremental use. So we've got some work to do there. I don't want to bore you too much because I'm probably pretty close to being out of time. Susan, am I just about there? Here's just one more slide, and then I'll give us a chance to ask some questions. We asked permittees, you know, how much money have you invested in capital equipment for a 3-year period? And the median value amongst those that responded was $1.5 million, so about $500,000 per year. If you look at the number of service connections, and at CMAQ we estimate that the average house includes 2.7 people, then people are paying on a monthly basis just a little over $5 to support infrastructure repair and maintenance. And if you divide that by 2.7, what is that, $2 per person? So, you know, we're really not spending the money to solve the problem with current rates. Most rely on that water rate revenue, and so that's very important, what rates are charged. How much water have we lost in 1 year? 22 billion gallons, which I know is an abstract number, but we figure that that's enough to satisfy almost 700,000 people for 1 year. And then we estimate the value of that lost water there. Loss is more severe with smaller systems than larger systems. We're doing something about it. We've got a water loss committee. We're rolling out free training on the industry best practice for water departments and their staff. So we're trying to help, and there you go. Thank you. If there are any. I know I kind of spoke fast there.
Can you talk to us about invasive species, or is somebody else going to?
Well, I bet you Judy's going to talk a little bit about invasive species. We certainly have hundreds of them in Lake Michigan. Yes?
What is the single best thing that someone can do to conserve water?
Well, you know, probably not water your lawn, except maybe once a summer when we get that little dry spell and it starts to look like it's going to hurt. I mean, it's okay to let your lawn go dormant. I mean, I usually don't water, but maybe once per summer, and that's when we have a dry spell in July. So that's probably one of the biggest things we can do to save money. I mean, anymore when you upgrade a toilet or a shower head, a washer. I mean, we have WaterSense labeled products, and I don't know if Judy will talk about that. That's a US EPA program. But slowly but surely, as we build new homes and then remodel our older ones and put new fixtures in, those are more conservative and efficient with water use. You know, when you buy a new washer, you know, always look for a WaterSense labeled product. I guess that would be one thing I'd recommend. When I was younger, I used to say shower with a friend. Yes?
So is there some projection of maintaining a sustainable level of Lake Michigan? I know 2 years ago we lost like a foot of water off of Lake Michigan because of the usually warm summer and the cold winds coming down and all.
It's more complicated than that. I'm going to actually get into that.
You're going to get into that?
Yeah, we touched, if not set a new record low 2 years ago, but in the 2 years since, we have completely bounced back to be either at the normal average or maybe even a little bit above. And so nature is the biggest dictator of the level of Lake Michigan. if it freezes and we have cold winters and it freezes over, that reduces evaporation. It's not the diversion that's the problem here. So it's climate primarily. Yes?
I have a question. Why would we send stormwater to the Gulf Coast?
Well, because we've replumbed the region, so the Chicago River no longer flows into Lake Michigan. And usually everything that hits the sewer systems, their combined sewer systems, it gets put into the Chicago River, the Chicago Area Waterway System, and it's routed to the Illinois and the Mississippi and then the Gulf. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Who sets the rates?
That's up to each community. If you're a municipal run system, if you're an investor-owned utility, you are regulated by the Illinois Commerce Commission.
Does everybody do all the suburb 5 in the city of Chicago? So are they the ones pumping out, selling to Park Ridge?
Yes, the city of Chicago.
So ultimately they do, and then they mark up from there?
Well, the city has to sell their water to a neighboring community for the same price it sells to its own citizens. So if you purchase water, then you know what that water is costing you, but almost every community that buys then boosts the price yet again. And if you're third or fourth in line, it keeps going up with every bump.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, what is the quality of the water in the Fox River? I didn't realize people drank that water.
Yeah, well, it varies seasonally, and whether we're in drought mode or whether we're having a normal precip mode. You know, with technology and the water molecule being what it is, I mean, you can clean any water. The question is always how much will it cost to clean water, but it can certainly be made potable, and it is. Yeah. Yes.
I thought, I had read from some time ago that there was consideration of reversing the Chicago River back to.
There's a discussion that's been underway for over 3 years now, 4 years, maybe it's in its 5th year. I've been on the advisory committee. It's an international committee that's looking at possible separation somewhere in that system to separate the Mississippi River Basin from the Great Lakes Basin to stop invasive species spread. So there are no easy or inexpensive solutions, so who knows how that will play out, but it is a topic being discussed as we speak. I better let the next speaker.
We better move on because we have another speaker, Judy Beck. Thank you very much, Tim. I think we gave us great information. So, the next speaker is equally as informative. Her name is Judy Beck, and she's from the League of Women Voters of the Lake Michigan region. In her hometown, Glenview, you will find a park named after Judy Beck in honor of her 32 years as a commissioner work with the Glenview Park District. And she's also served as president of the Illinois Association of Park Districts. Incredibly, Judy Beck has also held significant positions that have made her an expert on Lake Michigan. When I asked someone to speak from the League of Women Voters of the Lake Michigan region, everyone said, "You want Judy Beck. She knows more than anyone about the state of Lake Michigan." Now retired, Judy's still very busy with traveling and speaking engagements. Tonight is just one of these engagements. So here's what Judy has done for Lake Michigan and for us. She's worked as State Relations Manager for the U.S. Environmental Protection Regional Administration and on the Superfund program. Judy has managed the United States EPA Lake Michigan collaborative efforts since October 1995. She has chaired the multi-agency Lakeside Action and Management process that led to the Great Lakes Quality Agreement signed by the United States and Canada. A very great task, a most important agreement regarding the water in this area. Please welcome Judy Beck, and please reserve questions for the end of her presentation.
Thanks. I'm going to go through this and not take questions because I'm going to cover a lot of territory in a short amount of time, and hopefully your question might be answered in a slide or two. Also, I want to tell you this is a very difficult thing because people always say, so how's the lake doing? And my response is always, how much time do you have? So it's a very complex thing to talk about Lake Michigan. I'm going to try to cover the headlines of that and then hopefully answer some questions. And then if you want to know more, I can tell you where to get information, or I'll give you my phone number, okay? So let's see if, so how do I move this
Enter,
forward?
enter.
Just the enter key, all right. So the state of the lake is mixed. There are some positive and some negative changes. Climate change is really an exacerbator. So everything that was going wrong is going wrong now a little bit faster and in a more serious way. We have old challenges that we thought we had taken care of, particularly in Lake Erie, and they return, and due to climate change and a number of other things, they're intensifying. And we have new challenges. And as I'm standing here talking to you, there's something going on out there that we don't know about yet. We do have a lot of monitoring that goes on. Sometimes it takes us 4 or 5 years to find out about a new program, because we go through quite an intensive look in any kind of monitoring material that we take in, and it's a little bit of a frustration for not only the people who want the information, but by the time we tell the general public about it. And for instance, in just the last few years, we discovered that the medicines that we take in, we don't utilize all of them. They get excreted out, and sometimes that goes into the body of water, and the sewage treatment plants do not currently treat for those medicines. So we have to worry about meds in our drinking water. And the other thing is that we recently started looking at the problem of plastics. 2 different kinds of plastics. There's plastic trash, bottles and plastic bags. And then there is also nanotechnology, where we have used plastic in microscopic almost form, and we are finding that that gets into the water, and it is really a wildlife problem, but it also can be a health problem. And so these are 2 issues that are currently being worked on, and there has been legislation passed. And I will say that the cosmetic industry, which was one of the main drivers of the tiny plastics in different kinds of cosmetics, has responded. The good news is that when lots of people get interested and a company is concerned it will hurt their image, they do respond now. So this is a very unique system from around the world. 5 Great Lakes, and it's shared between 2 countries. There are 30,000 islands in the Great Lakes. It's drinking water for 24 million people, and there's actually more water that is used for products such as beer and cornflakes. There are many endangered species that if we lose them, the world would really miss them. And Lake Michigan in particular is a little different. You can see here that it runs more north and south, and there is something called the North American Flyway, which you see in the corner there. And the birds, over 250 different species, will fly through this area every spring and fall. The birds tend to nest and have sex and babies in Canada, and then when the weather turns bad, they tend to go to Central and South America. And so if you're a birder, this is really one of the best places in the world to be. And a lot of times, if you go out to the lake in the spring or in the fall, you will see lots of people out there watching this wonderful phenomenon of nature. So we have 2 countries that share this water body. And being people and political as we are, we have agreements. And so the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement is kind of, it's not a treaty. It kind of hooks on to the treaty that we've had with Canada since 1909. And it is a world-class model that other countries do look at. And the goal of that is to restore and maintain the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the waters of the Great Lakes. It was last updated in 2013, which added climate change and invasive species. The last time it had been updated was in 1987. And in 1987, no one was talking about climate change, and the invasive species issue was just beginning to be understood. And so we can see that while we're busy working on the problems we know we have, there are probably some new ones coming along. And then, as Tim mentioned, because we are concerned about the water in the Great Lakes and having enough of it, in the early 2000s, it was discovered that a community on Lake Ontario in Canada had decided to make money by selling some of Lake Superior to an Asian conglomerate, and they were going to come over and fill up tankers and then just float the water over to Asia. And people, it was unanimous. No one thought this was a good idea. So we ended up with some important cooperative work between all of the 8 Great Lakes states and the provinces in Canada to come up with a compact. Congress in the U.S. Approved this compact. And so now, if you're out of the basin and you want to use Great Lakes water, you have to come and ask, and all of the states get to weigh in on it. And this is very important, particularly when you look around the country and see that there are parts of our own nation that are now very water poor. So it doesn't mean that we wouldn't ever help anybody, but there is a very strict process in place. And the timing of this, for once, I think was really very good. So whoop. I went backward. Okay, so this is the commercial. This is a little bit from our sponsors, and that is we have an Earth, and it is unique. Today is, I think it's the 25th anniversary of the Kepler telescope, and the Kepler telescope was designed to look not only at our universe, but as far out as it could, to see, are there other planets out there that are maybe like ours? And they have decided that we are in a unique category, and it's called the Goldilocks category. So it's not too hot, and it's not too cold, it's just right. So that's why they call it the Goldilocks planet. So we're in that category. Some planets have water, but it's so hot that it evaporates off, or it's frozen all the time. So we really need to take care of this Goldilocks planet, and that's where stewardship comes in. And the stewardship is very important because we have unique ecosystems, and you can't be a good steward if you haven't learned about the earth that we live on. And so over the years, we've had a lot of problems, and the good news is that we tend to really roll up our sleeves, do some research. We have great scientific institutions in the Great Lakes, and we tend to solve our problems, but they keep coming at us. So some of you may remember alewives and botulism. Alewives were a small fish that came in, ended up dying on the beaches. There were so many of them. And we brought in some large salmon from Alaska to eat the alewives, and that maybe gave us another problem. Botulism is something that attacks the nerve, and it's found in all freshwater systems. But if we don't have a healthy freshwater system, and at the bottom of a lake or at the bottom of a large lake, if you have conditions that are anoxic or there's not enough oxygen, botulism can become active. It can then go up the food chain. And there are times when the fish are carrying botulism and our shorebirds will eat the fish and die. And there have been a number of instances where over 7,000 birds have died and have washed up on the shore of one of the most pristine places in the lakes, which is Sleeping Bear Dunes. When that happens, we know that's a big signal that there's something wrong in our ecosystem. In 1984, the UN Brundtland Commission talked about sustainability of the earth that we live on. And it brought everyone's attention and really to the concept of stewardship. And it said that humanity is at stake from unsustainable development. And a little bit of what Tim was talking about, so what are our limits? Do we understand what our limits are? In 1987, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement set phosphorus limits, and it named 43 areas of concern all around the Great Lakes. And they are in the process now of being cleaned up. And that has really been very helpful. In 1988, zebra mussels arrived. A tiny little mussel about the size of your fingernail, your little fingernail. And it came from the Baltic Sea, and it arrived in the ballast water. It was one of many. We now have 185 invasive species in the Great Lakes. And these species don't have the natural enemies, the natural predators that you would have in their home habitat, and so they kind of go wild. And one of the things that zebra mussels did is they're filter feeders, and they would take in water and they would filter it through, and so it made the lakes much clearer. And so people started coming up to me and said, I was out on a boat and the lake was clear and beautiful. And maybe if you're in some parts of Florida, that's fine. But for Lake Michigan, that is not fine, because some of that murkiness that you see is really other life. And it's life that helps support other kinds of fish. So the zebra mussel arrival really, really upset the ecosystem. Then in 2000s, we started having climate change kick in. We get about the same amount of weather and water, it's just that it comes in such severe storms and intensities. And that has really made a huge difference in stormwater, in what's going on with our ecosystems. It both, when you have all that water that comes at once, it really moves out and doesn't have the opportunity to sit in wetlands to get absorbed. And as Tim talked about, the groundwater is a very important resource. Just as an aside, underneath the Great Lakes, there is another Lake Michigan. There is as much water, groundwater, underneath the Great Lakes as there is in Lake Michigan. We have not done a good job of mapping that or being good stewards of it. So Lake Michigan, as I said, is very unique because it's more north and south. And in the northern part of the lakes, we have incredible forests and very high sand dunes. dunes have dunes up to 400 feet high. In Wisconsin, there is the Menominee Tribal Corporation, and it is a model of sustainability. For 150 years, that tribe has had a forest, but yet it has a lumber operation. So how have they been able to do this? Because they sustainably harvest their lumber, they replant. If you've ever been up to that part of Wisconsin and you drive along the road, it feels different. It looks very manicured, and you can tell that the trees have been planted because they're pretty much, they're not kind of messy, and there's not a lot of trees that are knocked over. They're just there, just as they were, they're planted, but the forest is still there. And so one of the things as the Lake Michigan manager for USEPA that I had to do is I had to deal with the 10 tribal nations that also share Lake Michigan with the 4 states. And we were supposed to develop a 5-year plan. They believe in planning for the 7th generation. And so you sometimes hear about 7th generation products. Well, they believe that that's your planning cycle. That's 150 years. And so they have actually done it on the Menominee tribal lands in Wisconsin. Also, those sand dunes that we've talked about, it's the world's largest collection of freshwater sand dunes. So what makes the Great Lakes special? We've talked about some things. Well, including the 20% of the fresh water on the surface of the earth. So a drop of water that lands in Lake Superior, it's going to take 200 years before it leaves Lake Superior. It's going to get to Lake Michigan, and it's going to come down the Wisconsin side, then do a turn, and then go back up the Michigan side on its way to Lake Huron, and that's going to take 99 years for that drop of water. When it gets to Lake Huron, it's only 22 years as it kind of speeds through. And Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, you'll sometimes see them join together when they talk about the different lakes, because geologically, those are the same lake. They are always at the same water level. So we have 5 Great Lakes, but really 2 of them are joined together. When you get to Lake Erie is the smallest, the shallowest, and it only takes, it's really a little less than 3 years for that drop of water to go through. It does have something major happen to it on the way to Lake Ontario, and that is it falls off the Niagara Escarpment, which is a very important, there's a basin, and there's the edge of the basin is very hard rock, and that's what gives us Niagara Falls. When it gets to Lake Ontario, it's out in 6 years. So just to recoup some of that, the surface water of the earth, 97% of it is salt. So you've got the oceans all around the world. About 2% of it is frozen. I don't know if that's a correct number now, the glaciers are melting, but that's what we have, the number we've been using. And when the glaciers melt, unfortunately, they go into the salt water. And then of that last 1% of surface water on the earth, 20% of it is in the Great Lakes system. So we are next to a world class, a global class system. So we talked a little bit about water use, and this slide is really talking a little more about groundwater, but I just want to show you about, just quickly, water use in time, because there are things that we have in our homes that people didn't used to have, things that we do with our my job at EPA to do it. It's called a Lake-wide Management Plan, which laid out the problems of Lake Michigan, and we began to work on the areas of concern. We had something called the Great Lakes Regional Collaboration, and believe it or not, it was Mayor Daley who went and worked with George Bush at the time and began a big dialogue in the Great Lakes about what is the future of this region. And Mayor Daley said, this is an important resource and we deserve more attention. So that got a lot of things going. The fact that we had those 185 species in the lake that people were really concerned about. And the good news there is we are requiring the shipping industry to pay more attention to that. And we are asking them when they use ballast water from a different part of the world that they exchange that as they cross the ocean so that they get rid of the species that they are bringing in. And many of our states and a lot of research has gone into this. And this is an important, a very important industry for the Great Lakes, but it's also can be a very detrimental industry. And so we have to work with them. The good news is that Lake Superior's lake trout is now naturally reproducing. That's not the same for Lake Michigan. I'll talk a little more about that again. And the low lake levels that we've had. And then one of the things that has reappeared is something called Cladophora, which is an algae. And there's too much nutrient in our water, too much phosphorus. And so we put it on farm fields to help the crops grow. We put it on our lawn to help our lawns grow. If it gets into the lake, then it helps what we would consider weeds or algae to grow in the lake. And that is extremely detrimental. And that is one of the problems, back to the botulism, that causes the lakes at the bottom to not have enough oxygen, which allows the botulism to grow. The fish take up some of the life from the bottom of the lake. They take in the botulism and then they die. The shorebirds eat them, and then we have those deaths that I talked about. And then the UN report came out 20 years later, and the concern for sustainability, and what they said is, you know, we haven't done it. As a global society, we are not making the progress that we needed to. So our challenges are listed here, and I'm going to go through some of these things. I've mentioned some of them before. Habitat diversity and species diversity and ecosystem health. So what kind of animals and plants lived here? Do we still have the same kind of situation where we have enough water for them, we have enough sunlight, we're not paving over where they're supposed to live? And then both the habitat and the species and how humans treat it is just all part of the ecosystem. And so if we're not keeping that all together, if we're either eliminating one part of an ecosystem, it's going to be felt because it is a whole system. So I'm not going to go through this and name all of these, but Lake Michigan has a wonderful resource that no one can see, and that's the Lake Michigan food web. And people talk about when they first came to America, how incredible it was that anybody that needed to eat, you could just go to the shores of Lake Michigan, there were so many fish. But that is changing. And so this is what a simplified version of this. And at the top, the major predator was the lake trout. It's kind of like a salmon, and it started to be in trouble in the 60s. We We brought in Chinook and coho from Alaska to eat the alewives. People still debate about what caused the decline of the lake trout. And these are great big fish. You know, it's the kind of thing you go out on a boat in Lake Michigan, you'd bring home a lake trout, and then you'd invite the entire family over, all the cousins, because they were so large and really just a wonderful fish. So the stocking continued for the lake trout, but it just hasn't been doing very well. And it had trouble in all the lakes, and as I said, in Lake Superior, it's coming back. And what they do when they stock fish is they will clip the fins so that later when it's a grown fish and gets picked up somewhere, they can tell whether it came from a natural birth or it came out of a stocking situation. And if you go up into Michigan and Wisconsin now, particularly on tribal land, what they do is they put the little lake trout, the tiny ones, in the same water that is in the stream that they're living in. But they need to do this like in a lab situation. So they have tractor trailers that they put next to the streams, and they keep the water in the stream coming through the tractor trailer so that the fish get used to that, because that's how they come back up to spawn. So we've had the problem with invasive species, and that has, as I said, thankfully slowed down a bit, but it has brought about a major problem. We have a little fish called a round goby. It's strange looking. Some people seen, some birds and other fish do eat it. But what happens when you get a new fish in, it will eat some of that life that is in the water, and it will take away from some of our natives. The zebra mussels we thought were a really big problem, but then along came their cousins, the quagga mussels, which were bigger. The good thing that we now know about the zebra mussels is they could only grow, they had to attach to something. So they would be attached to rocks, unfortunately sometimes to pipes out of a power plant. But the quaggas can grow anywhere, and they're continually filter feeding. And so they are adding to all their fecal matter is adding to the problems of the growth of the algae in the lakes. This is what happened for just 20 years of the zebra mussels. Because one of the things that happened is they'd attach to boats, and then we would trailer them, and they're all the way out west now in different bodies of water out there. Of course, we're dealing with the carp. And you'll see there's a continental divide. So Tim talked about the fact that we have a river and we have a lake. And we didn't have a lot of mountains here, but we had some hills. And they were basically moraines that the glaciers left as they receded. And that was a subcontinental divide. And around Oak Park is where one of them is. And it's the difference between the Lake Michigan water and then the water that naturally went to the Des Plaines and then down to the Mississippi. So if you've heard that carp are in the lake, that is not true. They are still in the Chicago waterway system, and the Army Corps of Engineers has installed electric barriers. They have a slight bit of electricity that they send through, and it has been working. They are close to the lake. They are something very much to worry about, but they are not in the lake yet. So the whole food web in Lake Michigan got turned around. Chinook salmon is now at the top. We hope to have the lake trout come back, but for right now, that's where we are. So I mentioned that we had 10 tribal nations, and the fish are very important to them. We have treaties with those tribal nations, the United States and the tribal nation, and part of the Lake Michigan Basin. We don't talk about it much. It's very important to people in Michigan and Wisconsin. The sport fishing industry in Lake Michigan and in the Great Lakes is a $3 billion industry. So the return of the algae, these are some pictures, thank heavens not from Lake Michigan, they're from Lake Erie, but I think you just really need to see them to understand how bad it can be if we cannot control the nutrients that we put on the ground. Lake Erie is a shallower lake. It has a lot of farming and agriculture. They put a lot of nutrients into their system, and this is what it does. It has, from time to time, had to stop all fishing in the lake. Last year, Toledo could not drink its water out of the lake, and that went on for a solid week. In Lake Michigan, the one place that we have a problem is in Green Bay, and that's because we have so many cows up there. And we have too many of them that they put in confined farms and systems, and a lot of times, particularly after the winter, the manure that is stored will melt, and then you'll have a kill in one of the streams up there, and it goes into Lake Michigan up there. So what all of this is doing with climate change and the nutrients, it's really changing the near shore of the lake. When you get out into the middle of the lake, you don't see any problems. It looks wonderful, and people would say, you know, it's just such a magnificent lake, which it is. But we live around the edge, and so we have got to take care of what's going into the edge. And I don't need to mention that that's where we get our drinking water from. So we have been cleaning up past problems that we had. And I'm not going to go through the water system, but the groundwater eventually goes into Lake Michigan. And when we use up too much of that groundwater, it's not just groundwater. It is Lake Michigan, or it's pre-Lake Michigan water. And so when we pull up too much of the groundwater, if it's not, as Tim said, confined, we can pull water that really should have gone to the Mississippi River. So we're kind of stealing resources from other parts of Illinois. And this is something that conservation of water is really not hard. There are so many easy things that we can do, and we all need to become stewards of this. There are climate deniers, but what we see with the lake is problems, and the whole UN look at climate change. It predicted just what we have. It predicted California. It predicted Hurricane Katrina, and it has predicted a lot of things. We need to pay attention to it. So one of the things that happened with Lake Michigan is that in December, January, when 2012 became 2013, we hit our lowest level ever. And the reason is due to climate change, because the lakes in the winter have always had ice cover. And when the ice cover is there, they don't evaporate. When the ice cover is not there, they evaporate all winter long. So think about what happened. You can see it down there on the chart at its lowest level. In the last 2 years, we had the polar vortex, and then this wasn't, like a hunky-dory kind of winter either. And we had almost all of Lake Michigan had ice cover. And what has happened to the lake? It has gone up. It is now up above that red line. So the lakes used to go up and down, but they used to say it had about a 30-year cycle. And you could tell, this year the lake's a little higher, and the next year it'll be a little higher again. No one ever dreamt that the size of a lake like Lake Michigan could go down to its lowest point ever, and then 2 years later be up above global significance, it's under stress, and it's in need of special attention, and that attention has to come from us. So we have steps that we can take. We need to realize it's a system and use an interdisciplinary approach. Sustainability path. It's not a spectator sport. It's up to all of us. And we need to mitigate our energy use, and we need to adapt to climate change, particularly when it comes to stormwater and awarenesses. And I'll be glad to take any questions. I hope I haven't.
Do you think we'll ever have to deal with our legislators with the issue of fracking in the lake? Because I know this was brought up in some of the discussions in the November elections when they had debates.
Yeah, well, so fracking is generally not a Lake Michigan specific problem.
Or drilling, I meant to say.
Well, so there is a ban on drilling into the lake. There is allowed what they call slant drilling. The state of Michigan has a lot of oil underneath the state of Michigan. And so they will start drilling on land, and they slant it in, and it goes under the bottom of Lake Michigan. But Lake Michigan, and this is not true for all of the other lakes, Lake Michigan does have a prohibition on drilling, in the lake bed. Any others? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I'm having to speak today. So the three things that I'm going to talk about is, she just mentioned the coal tar sealant ban, the Waters of the U.S. rule, and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, it's going to be really brief. I'm just going to talk about kind of why it's important and what you can do to help in our efforts. So coal tar sealants are when asphalt is applied to paved driveways or parking lots or playgrounds, any surface like that. They seal it with a coat that in this half of the U.S. is typically based with coal tar, which is basically coal that's been heated up to high levels. And what happens is once it's sealed over the pavement, it makes it look nice and black and shiny, and it extends its life, which is great, but unfortunately over time it wears down, and those small particles get either swept up by the wind elsewhere, or they get washed off into the streams by rain and runoff, or they can even be tracked into your homes on the soles of your feet, on your shoes. And what's bad about this is that the substance has very high levels of what's called PAHs, which is polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which basically, it's hard to say, but it's a carcinogen declared so by the National Toxicology Program. And so it's not something you want in your homes, and it's definitely not something we want in the streams because it harms fish and other aquatic life. And so we have worked towards a ban statewide for a ban on the sale and use of coal tar sealants. There are alternatives available to use. There's asphalt-based sealants, which are most often used in the western half of the United States, and they're typically about the same price, but they have much lower levels of these PAHs. And so this ban would be for the whole state of Illinois, and it would also allow municipalities to pass ordinances to enforce the ban. So one thing that you could do is try to talk to your legislators about supporting this. Right now, it didn't get out of committee in the spring legislators session, but there will be some hearings on it over the summer, and then hopefully it'll move out of committee and onto the House and Senate floors in the fall. But in the meantime, another thing that we can do is try to pass ordinances locally to ban the use and sale of coal tar sealants within counties and villages and towns. And so that's something that you can do, talk to your city council or village board about passing a ban. South Barrington, Illinois, and Winnetka have already passed bans, so it is definitely possible. It would help, protect your community, but also send a good message, a strong message to the state and to your legislators that this is something that you really care about.
Just real quick, if it's the same cost, who are the big suppliers of this coal-based tar that are
Yeah, so they're suppliers and they also have lobbyists.
Who
And
are,
really,
the league often.
the what, sorry?
The league often watches on and supports activities. We're gonna talk to our legislators. We need to know who is benefiting and who with supplant.
Right. So the main difference is that coal tar sealants in the Midwest, with our climate, with humidity and more precipitation, it does, coal tar sealants have been known to last a little bit longer. And so that's why the suppliers, there are a lot of suppliers that mostly use coal tar sealants in this part of the country because they don't have to apply it as often, as frequently. So that's really the main thing. But there are a lot of stores and chains that have completely stopped selling coal tar sealants because there are alternatives available, like Home Depot and I believe Lowe's. And so, I mean, it's definitely possible, but yeah, that's who the opponents are to the bans.
Are there well-known big companies that are supplying this stuff that we should get in their case? Like, probably not Monsanto, but there are people like that.
No, I'm not totally sure on which companies are selling it, but I mean, you could always ask them there's only two options. So is it coal tar or is it asphalt? And they have an option? So if you're getting your driveway paved, or if you know about a project in your community where they're sealing a parking lot, just ask which type you're using, and if there is an option, can we, make sure you use the asphalt based and not coal tar based. But if you ban it in the whole city or in the whole village, then you don't even have to worry about, checking up on those projects. And so that's what we're trying to do right now. And then moving on to the next issue. So the Waters of the U.S. rule is something that the EPA has put forth as a clearer definition of what Waters of the U.S. means. And what's important for us is that it would provide clarification on protection for streams, a lot of small headwater streams that feed into drinking water sources. And then they also provide a lot of other important functions like flood storage and improving water quality through filtration. And so there's been a lot of kind of uncertainty over which waters have protection and jurisdiction over them. And so this is just a really important rule for us, and also for anyone that's trying to get a permit to use a certain body of water, discharge to a body of water, like small businesses or farmers, because it just speeds up and makes it a lot easier to get through the regulatory process if there's more clarification. And so there are some opponents, mostly from the agriculture interests, that have really, their kind of opposing points have been, we think, misinformed. I think a lot of it is they think it's going to be a huge expansion of jurisdiction, and it's going to prevent a lot of farming practices from being done, and it's going to, create regulation over every little ditch that's only there a couple times a year, only has water in it a few times a year, and those just really aren't true. If you go to the EPA's website, they have a great kind of ditch the myth fact sheet that spells out what are a lot of the common misconceptions and why they actually are inaccurate. And so we've been really pushing for this rule, met with some of our legislators to try and get them to support the rule and not stand in the way of the rulemaking process from proceeding. Unfortunately, there's recently been a bill introduced that would basically disrupt the rulemaking process and require EPA to do a long stakeholder assessment that's really just kind of more studies that have already been done and work that's already been done, and it's just kind of, the intent is really to derail this rulemaking process. And so one thing that you can do is ask your legislators not to support this bill, and just to kind of let the rulemaking process take its course. And are there any questions on that? Yep.
Speaking from the farming community, because I'm on the board of the Chicago Farmers, there's a lot of concern about this particular legislation, because once you have the EPA or any organization regulating your local water supply, it costs money for the farmers because they have to comply with additional regulations. It probably, I'm just saying, this is the concern of the farming community here in Illinois. Our organization is all over.
Right, yeah. And we actually have a lot of the people that have come and been on our side and talked to legislators with us have been small farmers who realized that a lot of the impacts, it's not going to impact, every day. There's a lot of agricultural exemptions in the rule that are in the under the Clean Water Act already that are in this rule. They're all still included, so it's not really going to impact like everyday farming practices. It's not going to require new permits for these farmers, and so I would encourage you to look, kind of at the US EPA's website, and then we have some fact sheets as well, kind of spelling out what it will and won't do. The clarifications were intended to be included under the Clean Water Act when it was passed, in the 70s. And so it's not an expansion of jurisdiction by any means, and it's not the intention of US EPA, I'm sorry, it isn't to, go on people's lands and stop them from doing whatever they're doing and cost them extra money.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, of course.
So the Clean Water Act was passed and the regulations were in place, and then a suit was brought by a farmer from the state of Michigan. And there was a Supreme Court ruling that was very confusing. And the work that has been done to finally come up with this regulation has had stakeholder involvement. It's taken years to come around to this. So, and that's why it's called the Waters of the U.S. It's not called the Clean Water Act. And if anything, it's probably not as strict as things were prior to the Supreme Court, because it's got a lot of the concerns for the local farmers all built into it. So it's not a new expansion, it's just trying to go back to where we had been a number of years.
So what's it called again? You said it's not the Clean Water Act. You said it was something.
No, it affects the Clean Water Act, because the
But
Clean
it has a
Water
different
Act
name.
says the waters of the United States, and so this is to clarify what the waters of the United States.
So the name of the bill is?
It's not a
It's
bill.
not a
No, it's not a bill, it's a rule.
The rule, okay. So it's a
Yeah,
rule.
You said there was a bill in Congress to overturn that, but you
That's
have
right,
that
yeah.
bill number or bill name.
Yeah, so that is HR 1732. It's called the Regulatory Integrity Protection Act.
But it's in opposition to the work that EPA is proposing.
So it's, you are against that
Yes.
particular bill?
Yes, we're against that.
That's a little confusing.
Yeah, I know, it is very confusing. And then when you hear it talked about a lot of times, the rulemaking to better define the waters of the U.S. is called the Clean Water Rule. So if you hear that, that's what it's referring to, and that's what we do support. And then the third thing is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is a little bit more related to what Judy was talking about with the Great Lakes and how important they are and how much they really need our work and our ability to value them and see them as a resource we're lucky to have and lucky to hopefully have long into the future. And so it was created in 2010, and it's funding that allows for a lot of on-the-ground projects and restoration work throughout the Great Lakes Basin. I recently went to Great Lakes Day in DC, and we had a lot of groups with us that received funding from this, what's called the GLRI, and they use it to do a lot of great programs like getting kids out to do coastal restoration work and getting students out, and a lot of training for later jobs for some of these students. And so it's just a really great pot of money that can be used for restoration work, and it's been at $300 million, but the president's latest budget proposal suggested $250 million, and so a $50 million cut, which would really take money away from a lot of these projects that have been successful in the past. And so we've been advocating to keep it at that $300 million, but also to give it a permanent home so that we're not, every year having to go back and ask for the pot of money, but to just have the legislation in place and allow organizations to plan ahead and plan these programs of how best to use this money to be most impactful. And so that is another act, the GLRI Act, that we are in support of, and it's something that you can talk to your legislators about supporting this act. And I have a list of who's already co-sponsored, so who you just need to thank, and then who's not, so who you should really be out there talking to. And also there is a website that has a really great map, and you can zoom in and it'll show you where these projects are throughout the Great Lakes Basin, but you can zoom into your community or along Lake Michigan and Illinois and see where these on-the-ground projects are actually taking place. So we're
I'm sorry, we've only got 5 more minutes.
That's fine, that's all I had to say.
But I have a letter from Tammy Duckworth's office that I'd like to read parts of, which relate to what you're talking about.
Okay, great.
And then we have a presentation for our speakers. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Not Coal Tar Sea, but the other two. She says she's very happy to learn that the League of Women Voters of the Palatine area is hosting an event. And then she goes on, I welcome this opportunity to tell you about some of the work I have been doing in Congress to protect our nation's water resources. So we have postcards at the back. If you would like to encourage Tammy Duckworth's office to continue this, if you want to compliment her for it, that would be a great thing, because a lot of times people work hard on these bills and they don't hear from their constituents that they're doing the right thing. So here is what she says, 3 paragraphs. Along with my colleagues from the Great Lakes region, I have been advocating for strong funding and formal authorization for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which you were just talking about, Katrina. Since its inception in 2010, it has funded over 2,000 projects to improve water quality, protect native habitats, clean up toxic areas, and fight the spread of invasive species. This one act, this $300 million or that they were planning, and that has been cut from the original $479,000 when it was originated. So that has been cut since the origin of it. And now we're talking about $250 million. Do we need less money for this region? Are we having fewer problems? I don't think so. So this is something you need to encourage, that more spending, not less. My colleagues and I are pushing for a restoration of the current $300 million level of funding. When you write your note, go for the $479 million. You know, why are we going to be content with 300? Last year we were able to prevent the $25 million cut. So anyway, if you are going to respond to her, try to go for a higher level rather than lower. Although, you know, they've been discouraged because people want to keep cutting. They don't want to invest in our infrastructure, which is the Great Lakes, right for us. I also support efforts to streamline conservation programs in the 2014 Farm Bill that enable farmers to contribute to improving health of rivers, streams, and wetlands in our region. The new program was created in 2014. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program will combine several regional programs, including the Great Lakes Basin Program, into one that is more streamlined and better funded. In the Great Lakes region, the program will focus on projects that reduce the harmful algae formed by manure and fertilizer runoff from farms. Another issue we are debating in Congress is what Katrina was mentioning, in the administration's proposed rule clarifying which waterways are covered by the Clean Water Act. It seeks to provide regulatory certainty and clear up confusion stemming from conflicting court decisions and regulation about whether non-navigable waters and tributaries are subject to the Clean Water Act. I voted against legislation that would block the proposed rule and prevent any similar rule from being issued in the future. So please compliment her on that. She's doing the right thing. Lastly, I recently helped introduce a resolution opposing a plan by the Canadian government to store nuclear waste less than 1 mile away from Lake Huron. This is under Great Lakes. Canada's Ontario Power Generation is trying to secure approval for a facility in Kincardine, Ontario that would store up to 52 million gallons of nuclear waste 2,230 feet underground. Good idea? I don't think so. I have strong concerns about storing nuclear waste that close to a vital source of drinking water for millions of people. So that's another issue that's not on this list. But if you just look at the back of the quiz, the 3 items that were discussed are there. They're written in very simple form. Why you should promote these. There are postcards over on the table, or Renee has. So and they're already stamped. So all you need to do is to write. If you want to write Tammy Duckworth's name and her address, you can get it. If you go online, you just write contact Tammy Duckworth, and you can get that, Google it, so you can do an email, you can get her address, you can write that. There are also phone numbers that you can use, and she gives 2 of them right here. So if you want to write these down, she's asking for you to call. Those numbers are, her office in Schaumburg is 847-413-1959, and in Washington, D.C., it's 202-225-3711. So I hope somebody will be activated to do this. These people work for us. unanimous, whether they're doing the right job or the wrong job. So even right to someone like, maybe people who don't, I'm not gonna mention names, but people who don't seem to be involved in conserving our water. So I thank